Hello and welcome to episode 13 of That 60s Recording Podcast. My name is Joe Montague and I am your host. I hope you've had a lovely couple of weeks. Had a lot of great feedback from the last episode. Ed is such a lovely guy and so knowledgeable. And I really enjoyed making these episodes, and obviously it's a bit of a first having the episode split up into two different sort of digestible chunks. So I hope you've enjoyed that as well. Had an interesting email from a friend of mine in Germany called Nils, who is hopefully is listening to this, with a couple of little points. He plays George Harrison in a German Beatles band, and he's got some cool projects on the horizon. So I'll keep you posted when they arrive. But anyway, what he was what he emailed me about. I'm just getting my emails up so I can read them and be accurate with it. We're talking about when the first guitar pickups were made. And apparently they were actually made by Adolf Rickenbacker and a chap called George Beauchamp or Buchamp or whatever, however you pronounce that, in the early 30s for a lap steel, which is pretty interesting. And it's used on a guitar called the Frying Pan, which I'm going to put a link to in the show notes because that's quite a... that's quite a cool name for a guitar. And another little piece of information that was quite interesting was that the Telecaster was actually built to sound like a steel guitar, which sort of in the Western swing style. So Leo Fender wanted to make a steel guitar sound, but on a solid body guitar, which is where the Telecaster came into invention. So thanks, Niels, for getting in touch with those things. Always welcome. And I'm finding this really interesting because I'm learning a whole load of new stuff about guitars. Right. So, let's get straight on with today's episode. Oh, in fact, before we do that, I have one small announcement to make. If you follow me on Instagram and you subscribe to my drum stems, you will have seen today, or it'll be yesterday now, or whenever you're listening to it, so Monday, that I'm now doing the drum stems weekly. So rather than fortnightly. So my kids are at nursery and at childminders now, so I've got a bit more free time during the day, and I've just enjoyed making these stems so much, and I get such a lot of good feedback from them, that I just want to do them every week. I've got so many, and there are so many Beatles songs to get through that the idea of chipping away at them fortnightly, it was too slow for me, so I wanted to move a bit faster. So if you visit my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, you can sign up for the mailing list there. It's completely free. I have put a PayPal donate button on there, which I said on Instagram today. I was in two minds as to whether to do that because, I mean, the podcast and the stems are not something I'm doing to make money out of. It's just something I really enjoy doing. I get to chat with some amazing people about a really special time of music history, and I get to recreate some Ringo drum parts, which I thoroughly enjoy doing, and I probably do it anyway. I am doing it anyway. So the point is, if you want to donate to support it, then you're welcome to, and if you don't want to, that's also fine. Ultimately, it does take a lot of my time up, and I do enjoy it, but we do have to make a living, so I just put it there as an option. But it's not it is what it is. There we go. Okay, so so sign up for that to get your weekly stems. And tomorrow's one I'm doing, or today's one, which you'll if you're listening to this tomorrow, you won't have seen yet. I'm doing a day in the life, just to celebrate 80 years of John Lennon. I know Paul's got a bit in there as well, but I just thought it's a track I get asked for a lot, so I thought it'd be cool to do that. Which wasn't what I was planning on doing, but it's been a really fun one because there's loads of cool drumming in that. Okay, now I will get on with the episode. So this is episode 2 of my chat with Ed Oleszko, who writes for Guitar.com. So we start off by talking about Marshall and Marshall amps and how that kind of where he fits in with the sort of canon of sort of guitar gear. So that's where this conversation goes. So I hope you enjoy. Could we? Can I just ask? It's almost this is a. I suppose it's a little bit of a selfish question, but I'm interested. So the city I grew up in is the home of Marshall, which is Milton Keynes. But obviously Milton Keynes was only born in the 80s, so he wasn't there all the time. But I'm interested in just to give a bit of context to the listeners about this question. So before we did this interview, Ed sent me a loose time frame that we might discuss. And one of the things you mentioned is Marshall struggling to get hold of Fender amps, presumably in London. This is in a shop in London. So decided then to start making his own. And I'm surprised that we don't really see Marshall feature in the Beatles chronology. And how does Marshall sort of fit in with the 60s sound?
Yeah, that's, again, super really good question, actually. Jim Marshall had a music shop in Hanwell in London. Jim Marshall was a jazz drummer, you'll be pleased to know.
Yes.
And he was massively into drums, and he played drums and sold drums, basically. But had a music shop, so people came in wanting all sorts of things. Linked to that whole trouble to get hold of American gear, Fender tweed amps of the late 50s, 56, 57, 58, were the pinnacle of amps. Guitarists wanted these amps, and getting hold of them was an absolute nightmare. Trade embargo, or just the sheer difficulty of getting them shipped over to the UK and so on. So Jim Marshall and a couple of his friends hit upon the idea of building their own one. And, it's no surprise everyone in the sort of guitar world sort of knows this. The first Marshall JTM 45 is an exact copy of a Fender Bassman to the circuit, and all they did differently was use what components they could get in Britain. So the speakers were British Celestion speakers, and they decided to put 2 or 4 in a cabinet, and hence the 4x12 cab was born, or the 2x12 combo. 2x12 combo was pretty much born in the Marshall JTM 45 combo, and which later became the Blues Breaker, was used by Eric Clapton on that album we mentioned earlier, the Blues Breaker album, or the Beano album, sorry, and was nicknamed the Blues Breaker afterwards because it featured on that album. But that amp was a 2x12 so that Eric could fit it in the boot of his car.
What a story.
Yeah, and all these massive things in musical history have these tiny little things. 4x12 cabs came around from Marshall trying to get bigger and bigger sounds and bigger amps. They made some 8x12s, which the Who used for a while, and then the Who's roadies complained they were too big and heavy to lug around, so they chopped them in half and made 4x12s. They couldn't go any lower. The reason they had the 8x12s at the time, and then they had to use 2 4x12 cabs in a stack, was at this point the early Marshall amps, again, players were coming back all the time wanting louder and louder and louder amps, because audience were getting bigger and more raucous. You've heard with the Beatles, all the screaming and stuff. They needed amps to get bigger. Nowadays, we can plug through really good PA systems and be relatively quiet on stage and send that sound out to the front. I mean, arguably, I don't like being quiet on stage. I like volume. But that's a whole nother debate, which we'll talk about maybe another time. The argument of stage volume and engineers nowadays telling us all to quieten down. You don't get the same response, you don't get the same tone, all the rest of it. But in those days, it was 100-watt amps, because that's where the sound was coming from to the audience, from the stage, from the back forward. You think of Jimi Hendrix and those, Cream, the late 60s, big Marshall stacks behind him, couple of, 4x12s, 4 or 5, each side pushing out. That was the sound. They were barely even mic'd up. A few mics on the drums, just all that sound. Guitarists wanted louder and louder and bigger amps. The technology was struggling to keep up. The Celestion speakers in the UK were, to start with, 15-watt speakers. So you'd have 4 of those in a 4x12 cab would make about a 60-watt handling. For a 100-watt head, Marshall head, which peaked at about 120, 140 watts, if you used one 4x12 cab, you'd blow up all your speakers. They soon developed stronger and stronger powered speakers to handle and so on. But yeah, so the Marshall sound was massive through the 60s, and you think of those groups, and again, where I'd argue that technical equipment had a massive artistic impact is bands like Jimi Hendrix and then The Who Cream, Led Zeppelin, where you've got a power trio, 3 instruments, drums, loud bass, loud guitar, could only happen with big loud amplifiers. If you're trying to have a power trio when you've got an acoustic upright bass and a little 10-15 watt combo, you get Elvis Presley, which is not to degenerate that, but it's a different sound.
Yes.
If you put those same players pretty much playing the same music and riffs through a couple of 100-watt Marshall stacks either side of the stage, you go from Jailhouse Rock to the first Led Zepp album. You know? And again, because the amps were louder, drummers played louder. You know, drummers wanted to be heard more, so close miking of the drums, so the drums were all clear. That happened live, which then sort of happened in the studio. And again, bringing it back to the Beatles, the drum sounds developed. They were close miking them with Jeff Emerick from sort of Revolver onwards. Again, because the boys were coming in with louder and louder amps. You know, so like they needed to hear the drums, the early drum sound of one mono overhead and perhaps one kick drum mic or something wouldn't cut it if you had the studio with the big amps, you know. The Marshall didn't feature much for the Beatles, again, because I think they were pragmatic. There's perhaps one big reason was that the deal we mentioned earlier on with Vox and Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager in Vox, part of the deal for the Beatles to have this free equipment was they would only use that equipment. So until Brian died, which was just around sort of the beginning of before the White Album period, you know, before the Beatles went to India, they pretty much exclusively used Vox equipment. Once he died, then that sort of opened the door for other companies to come knocking for the Beatles, and Fender got in there then and got them a bunch of Fender guitars and Fender amplifiers, which you basically see a switch from the Beatles using Vox amps to Fender amps around the time of the White Album, which then continued through the rest of their career. What they didn't do was use Marshall amps, and who knows why. I mean, George was big fan and big friend with Eric. When Eric Clapton came in and played on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, it's possibility that he brought one of his Marshall amps in, because the tone on that is a bit different. But then he used George's guitar, the Les Paul that he gave George, that Gibson Les Paul Lucy, the red one. So my argument would be, well, if he didn't come prepared with his own guitar to play on, I doubt he'd have bothered to bring his own amp to the studio. So it probably is one of the Beatles amps and probably a cranked Fender amp on that track. But people argue it could well be a Marshall. The other reason they probably didn't use Marshalls became synonymous with the power trio, that big, 67, 68, 69, like I say, the Who, high watts as well, but we'll call them Marshalls for this time, this sort of argument. Led Zeppelin, 3, those sorts of bands. Well, they were big stage amps, which those bands then got as their sound, and they brought them back in the studio. By that point, the Beatles had given up touring. So they were back in the studio and actually reverted to using smaller and smaller amps. They found that their last live gigs in the big Shea Stadium and the final tours, they had these big Vox 100-watt stacks. They were sort of solid state by that point, or hybrid certainly and stuff. Sgt. Pepper's, they brought those amps sort of back into the studio, and Vox were always giving them the latest things and so on. But they started to realise that actually the sounds that they liked in a studio don't have to be a massive amp cranked up. It can be small. And they went back to, come time of sort of the White Album, Sgt. Pepper's and stuff, they were using small little combos, and much of, the later albums, Let It Be and Abbey Road and all that sort of stuff, was just smaller Fender combos again. Twins, perhaps some of them as well, which are quite loud Fender combos, but still, it's not huge, great, hulking Marshall stacks behind them. Probably because they didn't need to, So it could be as simple as that,
This might be a good opportunity to sort of discuss the evolution of miking techniques. I mean, I crudely record guitar at my studio, and I know the principles of sort of miking, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners do, of where you place your microphone in between the center of the cone and the edge of the cone. But I don't know I don't know anything at all about the development of guitar miking, if there even is one, if there is different guitar miking techniques that produce different sounds, and what was happening from, say, the late 50s through to the sort of 70s in terms of miking up guitar amps.
Yeah, good question. I guess really, again, it follows the technical development of the guitars, the amps, and probably principally volume. In the late 50s, early 60s, bands would be coming in, as we said, quite acoustic. Recording techniques were very simplistic at the time. Often it was to 2-track or 4-track. The first Beatles stuff was recorded to 2-track. Then the first fair few albums were recorded to 4-track. Although they'd have multiple mixing down from a few more sound sources from that, arguably they were still trying to capture the sound in a room. So things were more distant mic'd. Drums were distant mic'd. Amps were a bit more distant mic'd. There are pictures of the early albums where they'd have like a Neumann condenser on perhaps George's amp. It might be a 47 or something. Then they'd perhaps have a Neumann KM54 or 56, a smaller sort of pencil mic on John's amp, to try and get slight differentiation between the two amps and the sounds for recording. But again, these amps weren't massively cranked, hence that whole jangly sort of sound we talked about. Though, because they weren't that loud, they could use these highly sensitive, what we'd now call massively expensive mics. Ribbon mics were used, but not hugely with the Beatles on the guitar amps. Again, probably because they were too loud for the ribbons, even though it was, they weren't as loud as they could be. Certainly, if you put a Marshall stack in front of like a Coles, it will probably destroy it. But again, they wanted more sound, and the condensers gave them a big wide frequency range, a good sound. I think, very generally speaking, if we take the points in musical history in the 60s as the Beatles' early jangly sound and all the pop that was around that time, everything was quite distant mic'd, really, roughly speaking. When you hit Clapton and that famous Beano album with that big, crunchy, hugely loud sound, which is a Marshall JTM 45 turned up to 10, the studio engineers where he recorded it, which I think was Decca or one of those sort of studios, they didn't like it. So what they did was they moved the mic further and further away from the amp in order not to blow up the amp. That led to this big roomy sound, which was used on all these sorts of things. Live, bands had to use dynamic mics. The early 60s, you'll see Beatles live, they might be singing into like a Reslo ribbon mic and so on. But as bands and things got louder through the 60s, Beatles stopped touring, but like we talked about, those big bands, Cream, Led Zeppelin and so on, playing these huge live, free, The Who, big live concerts, hugely live sound on stage. Dynamic mics took over. And I think those dynamic mics just worked their way into the studio because they could handle this big power, and they got used on drums, the AKG D19, which we'll have a conversation about later. Made its way into the Beatles. They were used on drums because they had lots of them in the studio and they could handle the high pressure sound. But dynamics like that and the Shure SM57, what eventually became the Shure SM57, was then ubiquitously used on guitar amps through the sort of late 70s, 80s, 90s, still to this day. Arguably recently there's been a resurgence in ribbon technology, because people are realizing, I mean, I love ribbon mics and I use a bunch of old sort of ribbon mics in my studio and stuff, for capturing sounds, especially from smaller combos. You can get some great sounds with ribbons again. There's some great ribbon mics being produced today, which can handle louder sources and so on. I hope that somehow answers the question.
No, I think it does. I mean, just touching on that, one of the I think it's third episode of this podcast, we spoke to Stuart, I've forgotten what is Taverner, who runs Exaudia, and they have a microphone that is a ribbon specially adapted for handling louder sounds in general and guitar sounds. And I know that there's some touring acts that use his ribbons on their guitar cabs for that reason.
Yeah.
So moving back to sort of guitars in that case. Are we the sort of chronology or the timeline that I've got? It's seems to move quite quickly towards sort of 66, and then around about the recording of Rubber Soul, it seems to slow down a little bit, and there's not a huge amount of change in the back end of the 60s. Is that because they've got they've got a big arsenal of guitars and a lot of the sounds are covered, or maybe it's because they're not touring, so they're not meeting as many people who are giving them things, or why am I, well, first of all, am I correct in assuming that the stuff has slowed down, or has it not, in terms of them acquiring instruments, or are the techniques changing, or what happens towards the later end of the 60s?
Ultimately, yeah, exactly that. I think because they stopped touring. Um, George was quite the enthusiast for new guitars, and you see through, mid to late period Beatles, and we're taking this from sort of Rubber Soul to Let It Be, the final albums. Their most creative period when they were just studio musicians. George goes through a bunch of guitars. They get him and John get Strats, but John barely played his, whereas George used his quite a lot, and it became that famous. He painted it all psychedelic, and he used it on the
Yes.
international "All You Need Is Love" broadcast and so on. Rocky, he called it, and it then became he
Yeah.
used that for Slide in his solo career and so on. He also got hold of a Gibson SG, a Gibson 345. They got hold of some Martin acoustics. So George had quite a bunch of guitars until about the period of the White Album when Eric Clapton gave him this Gibson Les Paul, and he seemed to really fall for that guitar, and he used that loads on the later albums, on White Album, on Abbey Road. I mean, my favorite guitar tone probably is his solo on Something, which is that Gibson Les Paul.
Yeah.
And he does phenomenal sort of work with that. But then again, he had the Rosewood Fender Telecaster that was given to him that he used on the Let It Be rooftop concert. But yeah, I think they didn't use many other things because they were settled in the studio, and they experimented with what they had. They had a few new things coming in, but they experimented with the guitars they had. They used different amplifiers, different effects. The whole double tracking, the use of the ADT to get that wobbly sound. But they were quite pragmatic and loyal. Like I say, John in particular, he had that Rickenbacker for the first 4 or 5 years. He went to his casino and pretty much stuck with that. you know, he played a Strat on Nowhere Man with George, but quickly put it aside. He had a Gretsch, which he played a little while, but again, didn't really, possibly saw use on Rubber Soul. George moved through his SG, which I think he used on Taxman. But then that got the Les Paul came along. And they changed their amps to Fender. That was a big change in their sound.
Mm-hmm.
The later Beatles albums, but alongside the recording techniques, I think the change in the equipment at Abbey Road, or EMI it was at the time, massively changed their sound as well. They had all the valve desks and the valve preamps for the early albums, and then Abbey Road was recorded with this new solid state TG 1 2 3 4 5 desk, which was later used on like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and stuff. So it's a slightly smoother, less aggressive sound, less punchy, ever so slightly. I mean, we're talking intricacies of
Yes.
nerdy geekdom that most people. But I think if as a vibe, if you think of Abbey Road as an album, not just the songs, because there's some punchy tracks on there, but the overall vibe of it is a bit more laid back and chilled.
Yes.
And that sonics of that album, I would argue then, and because of the way technology, the desk and the preamps changed, arguably became almost a template for the sound of the 70s soft mid-tempo rock of the Eagles and those sorts of bands.
Mm.
And it's that slightly laid-back, chilledy vibe. I know things in society affected that, and songwriting and music developed into jamming and all this sort of stuff. But I think, yeah, the equipment definitely had a big effect on their sound, and then they had such an influence in the world that what they were using influenced other people.
What's the story of the SG? That's a guitar that I mean, I could be completely wrong here, but I see AC/DC, and
Yep.
George, and that's it.
Ye-
I don't see it before George. I don't see it between George and AC/DC, and I haven't
Yeah.
really seen it past AC/DC. I mean, how does that fit into all this?
The coming back to what I was saying earlier about the Gibson Les Paul, which nowadays we know, arguably the two biggest guitars nowadays are Fender Strat, Gibson Les Paul. Everyone on the street who's got no idea of guitars recognizes those guitars. Well, the Gibson Les Paul was a flop. It started off as the gold top in the 52. The first one came out with Les Paul himself, the actual musician. He had a bit of a help. There was a flaw with the bridge and the neck angle and so on, but long story short, it developed. They relaunched it in 58 with a sunburst finish, 2 double PAF pickups, patent applied for humbucking pickups. And it was this big, wow, this is the new thing. And they just didn't sell. I mean, there's between 1958, 1959 and 1960, there's about 1,500 Les Pauls were made and sold. The joke goes that nowadays there's about 3,000 left surviving because they're worth so much now that there's a lot of counterfeits and fakes and conversions and so on out there. But these guitars weren't loved. They were too heavy. They didn't fit the music of the time. And it wasn't until Eric Clapton, Mike Bloomfield over in the States, and then artists like Jimmy Page following on from Eric Clapton's big distorted Les Paul into Marshall sound. And that whole lead guitar thing spanned a massive, and Peter Green with Fleetwood Mac, now another Les Paul user, that they became popular again. And then all the artists in the late 60s bought up these old 50s second-hand Les Pauls. Gibson eventually reintroduced the Les Paul in 68, 69. They actually got it wrong and reintroduced the wrong model. But again, that's the story for another day. Where this is linked to the SG is the SG was the replacement model. So a Les Paul with its double humbuckers pickup, 2 pickups, and the ABR bridge and the stop tailpiece and the neck and so on. Gibson wanted a more flashy, less heavy, cumbersome, less old-fashioned-y looking guitar than the Les Paul. So in 61, they brought out the SG solid guitar. Only it was actually still called a Les Paul up until about 1962-63. So the first SGs, as we know them now, are actually still called Les Paul guitars. And they were the replacement model. Got rid of the old one. This slim, spiky, modern-looking thing, competing with a Stratocaster. It's far more sexy angles and so on. Was brought out. Les Paul himself hated it, so demanded his name be taken off it, which is why it then became the SG. As for usage, George had one for a while. I think then when he got his actual Les Paul as a gift from Eric Clapton, he actually gave that SG away to somebody from a band called Badfinger,
Yes.
who then went on to use it and so on. But George used an SG. Other bands did use them. Obviously, AC/DC massively. You just think AC/DC, SG. I guess into modern times, you've got bands like Stereophonics massively use the SG. People wanting a slightly different but still Gibson-y Les Paul sort of sound. They actually became quite big in metal world as well. The whole pointy, spiky sort of looking aggressive guitars.
Yeah, it's a surprising looking guitar to see somebody like George playing, I suppose. And to my mind, it's a slightly more aggressive sound than a Les Paul. Would you say that that's correct?
Definitely. Good ears.
Yeah, it feels a bit brighter and slightly thinner.
Definitely. I think basically you've got exactly the same hardware and pickups as a Les Paul, but a Les Paul is a massive solid chunk of mahogany and then a maple cap on top of it, and that gives that big, thick, woody tone. SG is, it's not half as thick, but it feels half as thick. They're much thinner, much lighter, all mahogany, and that gives a different tone. You've got the same pickups, but it just goes to show how much of the effect the wood has. You've effectively got a bit less bass, and what that happens is you get more pronounced mid-range and top then, because there's less bass in the guitar sound,
Yes. Was there this might feel like a stupid question, but nowadays we've got a lot of Chinese copies of guitars, and there's Fender has its Squire range, and not quite the same, but Gibson has Epiphone, so you can have an Epiphone Les Paul.
Almost exactly the same. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose Epiphone might have a little bit more quality. You might respect the quality slightly more. I'm not sure. I'm always careful treading around Epiphone because I know they made some beautiful guitars. Back when they were their own company.
To be fair, they still do. I mean, it is massively murky waters because under the Squire and Epiphone banners, you've got everything from the budget of the most budget Squires that you get in the Argos catalogue, or you did, back in the day, up to some of the first Squires that came out made in Japan were better guitars and better built guitars than the American ones at the time, and then the same with Epiphone. In the 80s, Epiphone made some guitars over in Japan, part of the whole lawsuit era where they made they were the official Gibson sort of brand, so they could still make them, but other companies, sometimes using the same factories, Tokai, Greco, things like that, were making copies. But these guitars were built so well, they were arguably as good, if not better, than Gibsons. I mean, take, for example, the first Oasis album, Definitely Maybe. They were famous for using these Epiphone guitars, which those 80s Japanese-made Epiphones are every bit as good as a Gibson. And coming full circle to today, to be fair, some of the most modern recent Epiphones, since Gibson has had a rebrand and a relaunch and new ownership and stuff, they're phenomenally good guitars. If for people starting out, or even just, you want a very good guitar for not too much money, I'd recommend Epiphone every day of the week. Fantastic. As with the Squires, there's some great Squires made nowadays by Fender.
I have a Squire, and my dad's got a 50. It's a 50s. He'll thank me for saying this because he listens to this and he'll love it. He's got it's a 50s copy, Squire copy, but I think it's a Japanese one or something from when he was young. So I'm assuming it's the 70s. I don't want to insult my dad.
it would probably be an 80s Japanese Squire. But yeah, as I alluded to, those first ones made in Japan, when Fender shipped out some business over there, some of the very first ones got a massive Fender logo and a tiny Squire logo. And they're still Squire guitars, but they're every bit as good, if not arguably better, than the quality that was being produced by Fender USA at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, good job, Joe's dad. You keep hold of that one.
Well, we took it to a luthier because it needs a refret, and we took it to a luthier, and he said this is a beautiful guitar and it's worth a lot more than my dad paid for it.
Yeah, definitely.
It is lovely. I think you may have sort of slightly answered the question I was going to ask, really, which is, I know from a drummer's perspective, if there's a lot of say student model drum kits that you can get that from the 60s that are still high quality things. They've got fewer lugs on them, but that gives them a slightly different tone. It's not necessarily better or worse. It's just different. And do you think a lot of a lot of influence on the sound of the 60s came from the fact that perhaps there was better craftsmanship of things, or was there cheap alternatives to these that were being used? Was there cheaper models of these guitars? Because it feels like the Beatles at the start of their career stumbled across quite high quality instruments right at the very beginning. Even down to Ringo's Premier drum kit was a cheaper model drum kit, but it's still a beautiful drum kit that is sought after today. And I'm kind of interested now. There's a lot of very cheap instruments, and it doesn't feel quite that way in the 60s. It feels like everything's quite high quality.
I'd answer that with a very simple yes and no.
Definitely, maybe.
I'll try and contextualize. Arguably, the cheap budget instruments, now the guitars of the 50s and 60s, often lots of them were terrible quality and very difficult to play. If you pick up a Hofner 40 like John's early ones, or some of the early acoustics, they can be very hard to actually play. The top brands of that era, the 50s Fenders and Gibsons, are unsurpassed in their quality. They were made by craftsmen. In Gibson's case, perhaps guys who'd been working for 20, 30 years sculpting violins and mandolins and real top quality instruments, applied that knowledge and technical skill to guitars. Fenders, on the other hand, were more made to be mass produced, but Leo Fender was a design genius, and some of the craftsmen, they were still hand shaping the necks and stuff, and they fantastic instruments, and you won't get as good a guitar today, mainly because of the kind of woods which they were using then, which just don't exist anymore, and the supply of the woods and Brazilian and all this sort of stuff which you can't use anymore, and just that perhaps they were using really good stock of things. So the top models in the 60s were great, but lots of the lower tier, mid to lower tier models, perhaps, the sort of, I can't think of brands off the top of my head, but you could get a local made in Britain sort of a Fender copy, for example, and the strings might be a mile off the fretboard. George's Futurama, for example, before he got his Gretsch Duojet in Hamburg, he's playing his Strat copy. I've tried to play one of those I played years ago in a shop, and they're not very easy to play. It's not like playing a Strat. So nowadays you can go in and get the cheapest Squier Strat, and although it's not as good, obviously, as a top Squier or a Fender or something, it's more accessible and easier to play. So the lower tier of instruments today are made to a higher quality than the lower tier back then. But conversely, I'd argue that the top tier back then was the complete best of the best. And much as the way you were saying about the Premier drum kit still having that sound, even the cheap little combo amplifiers of the 60s, things like Wem amps and Westminsters, little Burns amps and things like that, some of them are the best sounding, coolest, vibiest amps there are, and you can get amazing sounds because that technology in those days was all valve amps. So those things are phenomenally good. Whereas the cheapest amp you'd get today is some digital modeling. I'm not a big fan of digital modeling. I'm not a big fan of all these profiles because I feel like they're just an impression of something.
Yes.
It's a photocopy of a sound. However good they are, to most people, take a scan, print a photocopy of the Mona Lisa. Great, you can see it. But then you put it next to the real painting, and it's not as good.
Yes, I hear you.
That people have different opinions and different genres of music, and there's pros and cons for all sorts of stuff. But I would argue that you would still, if you plug an old 50s or 60s Gibson or Fender into an old 50s or 60s Fender amp, Marshall amp, Vox amp, Gibson amp or something, then that gives a sound which you will not get out of something you'd walk into a shop and get today.
There's two final areas that I just want to cover. So the first one is pickups, because this is something I don't know a great deal about at all. And again, there doesn't seem to have been much progress in pickups, and I could be completely wrong. But what was happening? That you've mentioned a few sort of classic models of pickup that seem to they're the models that I recognise that are still being produced today. So how did was it literally just sort of P90 and then a humbucker and that was kind of it? What was happening in the world of pickups through this time?
Pretty much exactly that. If we take Gibsons, for example, and then the Epiphones that the Beatles used as well, you had the P90, which was Gibson's first pickup. The humbucker, the patent applied for Gibson humbucker, was, and from a bunch of research, I mean, they're so well sought after nowadays and stuff, but, we do at the magazine and other things. I should probably mention for the start, well, do a piece you could perhaps put in at the start. I also do a YouTube channel called Tone Twins TV, where we focus in on loads of vintage guitars, equipment, getting old sounds, trying to dig down that rabbit hole of what makes the great sound and so on. In my opinion, the P90 is a fantastic pickup. The humbucker, name kind of indicating why, was Gibson's attempt to make a P90 sound, but to get rid of some of that hum. That background noise that you get with a single coil pickup. Because the two coils, you've basically got two pickups together, one's wired out of phase, so they cancel out the hum. It's that simple. Humbucker, that's what it is. Gretsch were actually working on a very similar pickup at the same time. You get the Filtertron humbucker on the Gretsch guitars, and that was being developed pretty much exactly the same time by a guy called Ray Butts, who then sold it to Gretsch and they used it. And he was working on it at the same time as Seth Lever with the Gibson P90. The reason why things haven't moved forward, and it's arguably true of guitar design, pickup design, amp design to a degree, we as a culture fell in love with those sounds. And again, this is why the Beatles and the equipment they used is so culturally important. That, a pickup, and they do occasionally, a company will be really brave and try and make something completely different, perhaps arguably technically better. In the 80s, EMG brought out these battery-powered active humbuckers that you'll see in guitars that Metallica use and stuff. And they got a really sharp sound and super clear. But people want the same sounds of the bands of the 60s and 70s. So try as these companies might, guitarists and producers and stuff, we're such a retrograde bunch. The reason stuff hasn't moved forward is the audience want that old stuff, and it's that simple. People want to play a Strat, they want it to sound like an old Strat. They want to play a Les Paul, they want it to sound like a Les Paul. A few years ago, Gibson nearly went bankrupt because they kept doing these, amongst other bad business practices, but they kept trying to push the envelope forward. They brought out these robot guitars which self-tuned and had all these built-in effects and all this. You could plug it straight into a USB socket into the computer and control all these things. Or Line 6 brought out a guitar which, in theory, had every great guitar built into it. And you turn a knob and it's a Strat sound, and turn another knob and it's a Les Paul sound. And guitarists pretty much unanimously went, nah, no thanks. We're just so stuck culturally in the old sounds, the old stuff, that's what we chase, rightly or wrongly.
That was my last question, and I'm so happy that you've answered it. That's what I was going to ask, and it's just fascinating. I mean, every time I have a conversation with somebody for this podcast, it reaffirms to me why the 60s is a period that I want to talk about so much. And you may not have, we're doing this on FaceTime just so everybody knows, and I might have a sort of resting bitch face, but I'm smiling on the inside. Everything you're saying, I absolutely love it. It's just surreal how so many happy accidents and beautiful things happened throughout the 60s in the Beatles' career. And it's so hard to talk about the 60s. You can't talk about the 60s without talking about the Beatles. They have to be a hugely central part of everything we're discussing. And so many, what's the word I'm looking for? Just lovely accidents happened that have informed popular music ever since. And I completely just love it. I love it. And I hope that some of the things that both you and I are doing can help bring a sort of a younger audience to understand why it's so important to sort of study that era and to look over it, and appreciate what influence it had. And I love it. You've re-energized me, and it's amazing.
Oh, great. Like you say, it's a brilliant way of putting it. Happy accidents through the 60s. You're the start of the 60s, you've got skiffle music and pretty much no electric guitars being used. Well, they were, but no, softly and acoustically and clean. And then the end of the 60s, you've got Jimi Hendrix and Cream and Free, and the Beatles with all the revolutionary stuff they did. And it's all these accidents, both in the studio and out of the studio, and technology developing and moving and so on. Amazing, really.
Before we finish, if you could just let everybody know where they can find you. I mean, I've been following you on Instagram, and you're doing, you might be offended by this, but a very similar thing to me, but guitar-wise, which is very cool. And I think a lot of people will be really interested to check out what you're doing, because it's very, very cool.
Oh, cheers. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love the stuff you're doing, and I think we've hit sort of a kindred place, just in different instruments, perhaps. But yeah, I mean, I've done session work and gigs and touring that for years, obviously, and I'm now trying to focus more on the recording side of things. I'm hoping to, and this is a world exclusive for you, so you can direct the followers, and it'll be interesting to see how many people follow, because there's currently me and one friend following this new account. My Instagram is Ed Vintage Guitars and Amps. But if people want to search on Instagram, and you'll hopefully want to do this yourself now, follow Vintage Tone Factory.
Okay.
That's going to be my sort of new enterprise where I put my studio to use, full of vintage amps, certainly, and guitars for people who can come in and do sessions, or I can do remote sessions for people. And the idea is that it's a vintage reamping service, so folk can record their own tracks at home, nail them properly into their computer using software and so on. If they then have a clean DI'd version, which lots of the software lets you capture, they can send that to me and I can reamp it through some tasty Valve Mic 60s preamps and so on, and they can choose into a vintage Fender Bassman or a Marshall or vintage Vox or so on, and can get as geeky as people like, perhaps stick some vintage fuzz or tube screamer pedals in the way, some old compressors and so on, and send them back the fully, so instead of paying for a whole studio day somewhere and then having to pay to hire perhaps this great vintage amp which they might use just for one track, or people can send me the tracks, have it all done remotely and hopefully at a fraction of the cost to them. So that's going to be the plan with that. May not work, but I'm hoping it does. So that's Vintage Tone Factory. So if you search for that on Instagram, hopefully that'll come up. I'm in the process of putting a website together for that. You can catch me on YouTube as well. I work with another friend, Hugh, another guitar journalist from guitar.com and Guitar Magazine. We produce a show called Tone Twins TV, where we feature a ton of vintage gear. We look into the intricacies of vintage guitars and amps and sounds and so on. So that's great fun. And then just keep an eye out in Guitar Magazine and guitar.com for the reviews and the articles that I write here and there, and if anyone needs a session guitarist, I'm always available as well.
I will. I'll put links to all of this stuff in the show notes. So you guys, everything will be there for everybody to go and click on. And I know we've sort of been back and forth on emails about your sort of new reamping venture, and I'm quite excited to see how that all pans out. I mean, one of the things I think is amazing is the photos of old guitars. I just love the look of your Instagram and the way that the guitars look, and I love seeing. I suppose because I'm a drummer and I'm not used to looking at guitars, it's just it's one of those things that makes me smile. I really enjoy it.
Oh, great! Cheers. Yeah, I'm much the same. I mean, it sounds like a loving pat on the back contest, but I thoroughly enjoy your content, and being such a Beatles nerd, I absolutely love not reading the clip. So when you put up some new tracks or you do a little snippet from one of your sessions, especially the Beatles stuff, I will deliberately not read it and try and play the Beatles songs in my head so I can completely nail what song you're getting from the drums alone. And so far I'm like 10 out of 10 for nerdy factor because I'm getting them all right, which means
Amazing.
You're doing a phenomenally good job. So yeah, well done. I love it.
I need to do some more obscure ones for you and test you.
yeah. If you start doing like Blue Jay Way or something, then
smashing. Right, well, I thank you so much for taking so much time out to talk to us, and I hope I mean, you're just such a wealth of knowledge, and I thank you for coming and speaking to us about all this guitar stuff.
Absolute pleasure, and hopefully, perhaps, like I say, if we do get questions in, or at a later date, perhaps when the vintage reamping stuff sort of kicks into gear, we could perhaps be back on talk more in detail about those sort of things, guitar tones, reamping, and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, I would absolutely love it. It's nice, it's refreshing not to talk about drums.
I'll happily talk about drums. Love drums as well.
That's it. Another conversation.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have that later on because we need to talk about drum microphones.
Yes, that's it. So we'll do a fake goodbye and then just continue talking. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. Take care, mate. Cheers.
So there we go, and a little insight into how the podcast is made. I got on really, really well with Ed. He gave me a little virtual tour of his studio, and he has some ridiculous gear. Ridiculous gear. So definitely go and check him out on Instagram. It's ed_vintage_guitars and amps. He's on my friends list if you want to look through there. And I'll link to it in the show notes too. I mean, he has some amazing studio equipment and guitars and amplifiers and microphones. And as he mentioned, he's got a reamping service that is on the way. So I will post about that on my Instagram as and when that happens. Okay, so in 2 weeks' time, I will be chatting with a friend of mine whose name is Neil Innes, and he's based up in Leeds here, and he has a studio which is all based around exactly what we're talking about. So it's all tape machines. He's got I think it's a Swedish broadcast desk that was actually used to record Michael Kiwanuka's first album, which is one of my favourite albums. I couldn't believe when he told me. It was amazing. There's going to be another two-parter because Neil is just loves vintage style recording. He's kind of like my recording guru. So when I was setting up my studio, anything I wanted to know, what gear should I buy, where should I buy it from, Neil was the chap that was my first port of call to ask. He's got some amazing stuff, and his mentality, he's very humble, and he makes it out that he doesn't know a lot but about recording, and he sort of fumbles his way through, but that's not the case at all. He knows so much. Whether it's just instinct or research knowledge, I'm not sure. He's brilliant. Anyway, Neil's studio is called ATA Records, so you can go and check that out. And I'll talk about more about that in the episode. But go and have a listen. It's kind of 1960s funk and soul, and there's a bit of jazz in there as well. Neil plays bass on all the records as well as recording them all. And he's got a really interesting blog on the ATA Records website about sort of the things that happen in sort of vintage style recording studios. So yeah, go and check that out. Which just leaves me to say, if you want to get in contact with me, I've had a lot of people get in contact with me over the last couple of weeks. So yeah, thanks very much for that. If you want to get in contact, my email address is joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. You can go to allyouneedisdrums.com to sign up for my weekly Stems mailing list. I want to say a big thank you to Joe Kane for my intro and outro music. The intro and outro music to this community podcast. And my good friend David Henshaw for continually supplying me with fantastic artwork. I'm so lucky to be surrounded by lovely people. Anyway, so have a beautiful couple of weeks, and I will speak to you soon. Goodbye.